Hello and welcome to this Best for Britain webinar on decoding populism. I'm Naomi, I'm CEO here at Best for Britain, and joining me on the panel are the Right Honourable Liam Byrne MP and Professor Bobby Duffy. Now, at Best for Britain, we constantly track voter sentiment on a range of issues because we firmly believe that when we change minds, we change politics for the better. This project on decoding populism is part of ongoing work that we're doing. So you're going to be hearing some brand new stuff today, but it is very much still the beginning, not the end of this project. And there's going to be plenty more to come over the next few months. So thank you all for joining us today. There is a huge amount to get through, and we want plenty of room for Q&A. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, to put questions forward. And once we've done the presentations, then I will bring forward questions to put to our panelists. So for now, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to pass over to Liam Byrne.
Naomi, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be on this together with you, and a huge thank you to Best for Britain for the incredible work in pulling together a lot of the research behind this. So on the first slide that we've got here, we're just going to give you a quick sense of the agenda for what we have ahead. So just a quick introduction, and then absolutely delighted that Professor Bobby Duffy, who helms the Policy Institute at King's College, is just going to run us through the output from the first poll that we did and which we published earlier on in the summer. And that was the work that provided a really nice kind of segmentation of the reform vote, just making it clear that this is a coalition of voters that we're talking about. And some of that coalition are more tractable for mainstream parties than others. We then want to just share with you or point you to an independent ethnographic study that we found really interesting before we then go on to share with you the results of the second wave of polling that we're publishing today, and then there'll be lots of time for questions. So on the next slide is just a sense for you of the kind of project that we're bringing together. So first thing to say here really is that there are lots of extraordinary organizations, lots of think tanks, great academics and political scientists, economists that are at work in this field. And what we've tried to do is to weave in and out of that and provide some just a bit of more grist for the mill. So I have been running a project on decoding populism with a friend of mine, John Glenn from the Conservative Party at St Anthony's. We've been working with think tanks internationally. We've got a really interesting piece decoding the populist rhetoric that we're going to publish a bit later on in the year. There have been some financial investigations looking at the money map, which we've been supplying into the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy here at the House of Commons. We were really lucky to be able to host Professor Jane Green in the British Election Study team here at the House of Commons. The ethnographic study we will point you to in a sec. And then the main piece of work that we want to share with you today is some of the YouGov work that draws on so many of the insights from so many of the brilliant organizations that have been working in this field. We hope that we can make a bit of a contribution to that research today and share with you some of the new insights that we found useful. So with that, I will hand back now to Bobby, who I think is going to kick us off with a reprise of the first extraordinary bit of polling that we published earlier on this summer.
Great stuff. Thank you. Thanks, Liam. Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, if we click on, Cal, to the next slide, I'll just run you through a little bit of what we did. So this was a big study. It was a big sample of 4,000 GB-wide general public respondents, plus 4,000 reform supporters and considerers. And I'll show you the breakdown of that in a second between those two groups of actual voters and considerers. And the main focus was to look at two main focuses, really, to make clear the overall differences between the reform considerer and voter sample and GB-wide data to see what made them distinctive. But then also, as Liam says, to break that down into a new segmentation that YouGov very helpfully developed. And there's been lots of work, segmentation work around reform, including overlaying existing political segmentations to see how they differ in profile from the public as a whole. But ours was really specifically tailored to reform, which I think adds a different dimension and does help us understand, crucially, again, as Liam signaled, the fragmentation in that overall grouping, as well as the commonalities. So we ended up with 5 segments of roughly equal size, which is always helpful in a segmentation analysis. The first one is what we've called disgusted disruptors, who are more economically to the right, most anti-establishment in their views, strong sense of personal injustice, have a culturally populist sense, and have a real sense of strong decline among them. They're about 1/5 in population. Then we have left behind collectives, who are struggling the most financially, also a strong sense of decline, but also a strong believers in the welfare state and free healthcare, as we'll see in a second. Then we got the traditional conservative groups, who do come mostly from a past voting for conservatives, financially most secure, meritocratic, but the most pessimistic for the future of the country. They are 1 in 7, slightly smaller, but they are more likely to vote, an older age profile, more likely to vote. So still valuable electoral for election point of view. Then we have the melancholy middle, who are the least anti-establishment, most highly educated, and financially middling to secure. Again, 1 in 5 of the population, more culturally liberal in as well. And then finally, civic pragmatists, who are relatively more progressive in their views, more patriotic and younger, financially in the middle in many senses, and have a Europhile element to them, which again we'll see in a second. So if we go to the next slide, Cal, as I say, you can see quite a difference between these segments in their commitment to voting reform. Here we break it down into those who say they're intending to vote for Reform UK and those who are considering. And there's really that step down, particularly for the bottom 2 segments, the melancholy middle and the civic pragmatists, in that commitment to. And I guess that is one of the major points of the research to highlight, is that most of our images, lots of the images in the common discussion of reform voters and considerers, is probably skewed to the top 2 or maybe 3 of the segments that we put in here, but it's actually more varied than that. And it's important to remind ourselves that, and it's not just small segments. These are chunky segments that are quite different. And then finally, if we go to the next slide, Cal, just to show you the types of differences that we see, just all on one slide. As Liam says, many of you in this webinar have already seen this, and there is a full report available, so I won't dwell on it too much. We want to get on to the new work. But there's certainly features that unite the segments in terms of frustration, pessimism, cultural concern, immigration attitudes, things like that. But there are lots of demographic and attitudinal differences between them. And there's just 5 examples on this slide of the different spectrum across unity and division among these groups, so that they are pretty united on wanting a strong leader. It's 36% for the population as a whole, in contrast to the segments here. But that overall picture includes reform supporters, so it's actually lower for supporters of other parties. So it's only around 20% of Labour, Lib Dem and Green supporters who say they want a strong leader. But even within that, even within this strong leader who breaks the rules and gets things done, there's variations within the reform segments. Then we do see very different views among the civic pragmatists on things like the environment, and whether climate change is something we need to act on the next block, or at the one at the other end, in terms of the UK and the EU should have closer relationship with one another. And we see this throughout the study, that individual segments will stand out as being quite different on individual issues. But then there's also similarities between segments across the more and less committed groups. So if you look at the welfare one, the welfare state should help everyone and anyone when they need it. A real similarity between the left behind collectivists and the civic pragmatists. And similarly with the NHS, should be free, available at the point of need for anyone who requires it. Those unite across what is a divide in terms of levels of commitment to reform. So a much more varied and complex picture brought out by this segmentation. But as I say, much more in the full report. Won't dwell on this too much, but hand over to Liam to talk more about the new elements he's been leading with Best for Britain.
Perfect, thank you. If you wouldn't mind, Cal, just clicking onto the next slide. So just to underline that last point that Bobby Duffy made, there's an enormous well of data that sits behind that first poll that is available on the Best for Britain website. I'm doing my best just to provide a graph of the day at the moment, which I'm publishing on the Substack, because it just gives you a sense of just how rich and varied some of this polling work is. We confirm in our findings many of the findings that Professor Jane Green at Nuffield has come to about the financial insecurity that many of these voters are feeling. When you look across these different tribes, there's some who are actually slightly better off than the national average, some that are slightly poorer than the national average. But there's a couple of things that that really distinguish these voters from the British public as a whole. One is quite a pronounced sense of financial insecurity. That probably reflects the age of many of these voters. Many of these voters will be in their late 40s or 50s, looking at their retirement years actually with a sense of dread. But what also stands out, particularly amongst the more hardcore reform voters, is this sense of financial disappointment. So if you think about the two of those groups that Bobby just highlighted, disgusted disruptors and left behind collectivists, about half say that they're not as well off as they hope to be at this stage of their life. A quarter will say that they've fallen behind their peers. And overall, about a third would say that their wealth is likely to decline over the next 10 years. So for them, it's not simply a case of hard work doesn't pay, it's hard work hasn't paid. Sentiments are very stark. 2/3 of the more hardcore reform voters say that their children will be worse off than they are. Amongst the disgusted disruptors and left behind collectivists, that's over 60%. There's quite a pronounced sense of powerlessness that comes through in the data. And something that I think is really important, partly because I reflect on my own constituency, I suppose, about 80% of the more hardcore reform voters say that their area is in serious decline. So these area effects, I think, are probably quite significant. That's about twice the level of the national average. Really pronounced feelings of disrespect, not feeling respected by society, a real sense of loss of dignity. This won't surprise you, but a real sense that politics is broken, that taxes are spent on the wrong things, that people don't get their fair share of taxes or public spending, and a sense really of disgust, anger, and frustration. So when you put all of that together, I think many of the sentiments that you see animating the reform vote become a lot more understandable. Now, you will have different reads on this data, which is why what we're trying to do with this work is maximize the transparency so that that data is out there for you to kind of play with and gather your own kind of conclusions. The one thing that we just wanted to add at this stage is just to point you to an independent ethnographic study, which was actually based on this segmentation, which just provides a little bit of color to some of the data, provide some of the stories behind the statistics. And Naomi can share the link to that if you're interested. Just wanted to share a couple of the beats that emerged from that work that just sort of reinforce some of the things that Bobby has just shared with us. So it's a kind of a portrait of voters who have had pretty hard lives. Actually, there's often been something quite significant that's happened in early life. There are lots of stories there of love and loss, and the way people have had to kind of then pick themselves up and through hard graft just about keep their head above water. But they are definitely now people who feel unrewarded, unrecognised by society, and let down by a political system that they just no longer trust. And there's a real determination amongst the stories that we heard to try and make it on their own, to try and stand on their own feet, but just a sense that that challenge has got harder and harder and harder and harder. So the stories that we saw in that study are riddled with frustration and disappointment, and a conclusion that life hasn't turned out as people hoped. A real sense that life has shifted from thriving to coping, and the task of coping is getting harder and harder. A sense that people will never catch a break, that bills are always going up faster than wages. And when people look out on the country, the stories that they shared were stories about how they felt the country was in decline, but how crucially their communities were really in decline, and how little agency people felt about their ability to do anything about it. And this rhymes with some brilliant work actually that Bobby and colleagues published earlier, I think in the week, Bobby, if not last week, about the lack of agency and the powerlessness that people feel. I think that these have got really significant political effects. And this story about local communities really came through very, very clearly. So when the study asked people to share the kinds of images that conjured up what was going on in their local area, you had lots and lots of images of things like boarded up shops, high streets in decline, community spaces and public spaces that were once a hubbub of community life, now boarded up. The old butchers and greengrocers now replaced by barbershops and bookies, lots of fly tipping, lots of shuttered public buildings, a real sense, a palpable sense of decay and decline, coupled with a sense of real powerlessness and an inability to do anything about it. So all in all, there was a feeling that I saw in this study about rising frustration, bordering on exasperation. And that very much was colouring the way that people felt about immigration and about politics. So this hunger for a strong leader is something that characterises many of the tribes of reform that we zeroed in on. But obviously, it's also fueling frustration and anger about the immigration system, and a sense that there are others who are getting things that they didn't work for, when for the lives of so many of these voters, life has been a kind of a constant struggle. And that's all kind of adding up to this hunger for a leadership that, in the words of one of the people featured in this independent study, looks after our own. Why can't we look after children and pensioners and others in our community before looking after others? So I found the study really interesting, and it's definitely worth your time taking a look. Now, that has set the stage for the polling that we want to share with you today. And there are a couple of pieces to this. The first is a piece that we'll share with you now, and the second is a piece that we'll share with you a little bit later on, ahead of the budget, which zeroes in on some questions about the kind of living standards offer that people are in the market for, and crucially, how people think that should be paid for. But our priority was to really take what we had learned from our work, and crucially the work of so many others, and try and boil that down into an answer to a simple question. What are the messages that are most effective in countering the rise of reform? So on the next slide, we have got a series of statements. There we go. Yep. And there's no originality in these statements. There's an enormous amount of work out there from think tanks and campaign groups. And based on the polling work that we've done, we sieve through this to try and figure out 8 basic sets of messages, which we then pitted one against another in a kind of message duel. So the conjoint analysis that we undertook together with YouGov basically pits one of these messages against another in random couplings. And the question that we ask people is, which of these messages do you find most convincing? So just to run through these messages very quickly. On the economy, Nigel Farage has made billions of pounds worth of spending commitments without any idea how to pay for them. That is a real risk to mortgage rates, food and energy bills in the future. And when prices are already high, we just can't allow that to happen. The second was on employment rights. Again, a message that has been quite well tested from others. Parliament has just tried to pass laws, we're still in the process, banning exploitative zero-hours contracts, protecting sick pay. Reform voted against it. They want to scrap employment protections, cut away health and safety rules. Mr. Farage talks about helping working people, but actually he's voting to take those rights away. On social security, again, reform here. They want to slash public spending by an extraordinary amount of money. Last total about 140 billion. And that is going to mean cutting away social security protection from people who need it. The fourth message was then around NHS access. Again, just telling people the truth about what Mr. Farage has said about his preference for a US-style insurance system for the NHS, and just pointing out that that is going to really jeopardise free care at the point of use. We've then got a message about Donald Trump and Nigel Farage's close relationship with the President of the United States, just to test that. Then we had a message on corporate interest, just again explaining to people the sheer amount of money that Reform and Mr. Farage have taken from folks like fossil fuel lobbyists. And then on Brexit and immigration, some nuances that are just important for me to explain now because they'll become important in the next couple of slides. So on Brexit and the effectiveness of Brexit, the point that we made here is that Mr. Farage was obviously the chief architect of Brexit. It's badly damaged the UK economy, not our assertion. That's the assertion of the Office of Budget Responsibility. Said it would be great for the country. In reality, it's pushed up prices, slowed growth, made us all poorer, but he doesn't regret it. And that is just a proof point that he's not going to do what is right for ordinary people. And then on immigration, we make the point that if we were still in the EU, or when we were still in the EU, small boat crossings were obviously much lower. And therefore, Mr. Farage has, in pushing for Brexit, had a role to play in the kind of problems that the immigration system now confronts. So those are our statements. Thank you to everybody out there in think tank land and campaign land for all of the hard work in generating these kinds of ideas. Apologies if we haven't quite synthesized everything that we heard in a way that you like, but I think we made actually a pretty good fist of it. And the conjoint analysis basically pits one of these messages against another to see which of the messages that people chose as the most convincing of the two. And by the time we've done that thousands and thousands of times, what we get is a hierarchy of messages which people found most convincing. And that is what we can reveal on the next slide. Cal, if you would just move us on, I'll share with people. Here is the Premier League of messages that people found most convincing. What we saw in the data is essentially a Premier League and a championship. These were the messages that people found the most convincing. The second set of messages weren't a million miles away, but they were distinctly well behind these messages. And what you can see from these messages is that there's not a great deal that divides them. So there's only a 3-point difference between the message on the economy and the message on NHS access. So the economy, employment rights, social security, and NHS access. These were the 4 messages that people found most convincing when it came to messages for countering reform. What we wanted to share, though, is the subtlety that the segmentation allows us to provide. And on the next slide, we have a slightly complicated picture, but I hope what this conveys is a sense of the way that different segments of the Reform Coalition think about some of these messages differently. And what I'd really like you to do is to just look at the bottom 2 rows, so the melancholy middle and the civic pragmatists. Remember, these are the 2 most tractable groups of the Reform Coalition. So around 40%, 40 to 41% of these 2 groups are merely considering reform rather than intending to vote for them at the next election. So these are the 2 most tractable groups of reform. And what you can see here is that they have slightly different priorities to the overall story. So if we look at the melancholy middle, that line second up from the bottom, what you can see here is that this group found the message on NHS access the single most convincing message. But employment rights came in at the same number. So they're both NHS access and employment rights are at 59%. So those are the 2 most convincing messages for the melancholy middle. The economy, though, is just a whisker behind at 58%. Social security is a slightly more distant 4th. So amongst the melancholy middle, the 3 most persuasive messages were on NHS access, employment rights, and the economy. The bottom line then shows what happened amongst civic pragmatists. So here again, you get a slightly different picture, but the economy for them is top of the list. And again, by quite some distance. So amongst civic pragmatists, 59% found the economy message the single most convincing message in the message duels. You can see employment rights came in second at 52%, Brexit damage at 52%, and then social security, NHS access and immigration at 50%. So just a more complicated and nuanced picture. The next slide then just shares with you the data for a couple of follow-up tests that we did. So once somebody had picked a message as the most convincing, We then asked them a couple of follow-up questions. So the first follow-up question that we asked them is, okay, look, you've picked that message as the most convincing. Tell us how negative that made you feel about reform. And then we went on to say, and how convinced actually were you by this message? So again, what you can see on this slide is a couple of important takeaways. The first takeaway is that on melancholy middle and civic pragmatists, they're showing higher scores than the rest of the tribes. And I guess what that just underlines is that these are the two most tractable groups in the Reform coalition. They are more likely, more susceptible to feeling more negative about anti-reform messaging than anybody else. So that's kind of takeaway number one. And takeaway number two is, again, just appreciate some of the differences in the negativity scores that people recorded here. So on civic pragmatists, for example, you can see the real kind of standout number is 40% felt more negative. Those who picked the NHS Access message, 40% then felt pretty negative about reform thereafter. But you can also see that there were quite high negativity scores for both the message on Donald Trump and indeed on Brexit. That is a slightly different story to the melancholy middle. The melancholy middle, again, NHS Access message was the thing that made them feel most negative about reform, but that was paired with the economy. So again, I think the point that we really want to get across here is that in countering reform, it is really important to zero in on the most tractable things in the reform coalition, because there are nuances in the way that these different groups think about reform. And then just for completeness, Cal, on the next slide, we've got the data on how convincing people found these messages. So again, what these numbers represent is, let's take the column on Donald Trump, which is the first one on the left. So for those voters who chose the Trump message as the most convincing, how convinced were they about that message? And here, if you look across the rows, what you can see is that NHS Access, again, was the most convincing message for civic pragmatists. And then on the melancholy middle, the message on the economy was the most convincing. So where does that leave me, having ground through all of that data? And please do grind through it yourself and share with us your insights. Where that leaves me is that you've got first 4 standout messages that are important in countering reform: the economy, employment rights, social security, and NHS access. They are your Premier League of messages when it comes to taking on reform. However, the second takeaway is that amongst this key group of civic pragmatists, there are other messages, like the message around Donald Trump, around the damage of Brexit, and around the virtue of good EU relations in fixing the immigration system, that do have an important element of cut through too. So for that particular group, there is some additional nuancing and targeting that is needed for messaging. So that's the big chunk of data that we wanted to share with you by way of the insights from the conjoint analysis. There's one final section, though, that we wanted to offer today, which we thought you'd find interesting, and that's about the role of antagonists. Now, antagonists are essential in politics, just as they are in all drama, and the rhetorical analysis that we've undertaken of populist messaging reveals the obvious, that there is an antagonist in all populist messaging, and it is by and large foreigners. In the United States, for a long time, people like Pat Buchanan and others have taken aim at Mexicans. Here in Europe, there is a very pronounced level of anti-Islam messaging, but that antagonist of immigration is something that is absolutely fundamental to populist messaging. However, in the first poll, what we also noticed is that there are other antagonists. So in particular, amongst the more hardcore reform voters, your disgusted disruptors and left behind collectivists, there was a real antipathy towards the way they felt the market was rigged against them and in favor of the rich and powerful. So again, that data is available in the first batch of polling that we produced, but we were quite curious about this. And so we decided to follow it up by just testing the way in which people perceive the role of big business and certain types of big business in explaining the ills of the country. So on the next slide, Cal, if you wouldn't mind just clicking through, here are some interesting results about antagonists. So the question is pretty simple. Thinking about the state of the country, do you think each of the following has got a positive or a negative impact on the UK as a whole? And the red bars are the GB average, and the blue bars are those considering reform. So as you can see, when it comes to large businesses, if you take the entire population of reform considerers, you can see there's a level of positivity about the role of big business. That positivity is not true when it comes to energy companies or banks. And what you can see in this second chart is that amongst reform considerers, they are far more negative about energy companies than the national average. Banks, it's pretty much a score draw, and on supermarkets, it's pretty much a score draw too. However, if we then go on to the next slide, what we've got in this next slide is the breakdown by reform segment. And what this reveals is quite a different picture. So what you can see here is amongst the more hardcore reform voters, by which I mean those who are overwhelmingly planning to vote for reform rather than merely considering a vote for reform. So amongst disgusted disruptors and left behind collectivists, you can see that overall they are net negative about the role of large business in the country. They are very, very negative about the role of energy companies, and they're pretty negative about the role of banks. Disgusted disruptors are also negative about the role of supermarkets. The left behind collectivists just a shade positive, but it's pretty close. So that is a different kind of story to the story that reform is telling. And just to follow up this particular set of polling questions, we then asked why. And so on the next slide, you can see the answers to why reform considerers think that energy companies have got a negative impact on the country, and this won't amaze you. Increasing prices too much, rewarding bosses with bonuses when companies are failing, influencing politicians comes in third, but you can see overwhelmingly the causes of negativity are around prices and what people see as unfair rewards. It's not a totally dissimilar picture when you come on to the next slide, please, Cal, which is why people think banks have got a negative impact. And again, this idea of unjust rewards is what tops the table. Influencing politicians for their own interests comes in second. And then you've got the role in exporting jobs and avoiding taxes in at fourth. So I guess what that gives you is just a sense that there is a different story that can be told about antagonists. The caveat, of course, is that although that story about economic populism may have real cut through and purchase with some sections of the reform vote, the cut through and purchase is not really amongst those voters who are likely to change their mind at the next election. So yes, there is a market for economic populism. Will it move reform voters out of the reform column? Data doesn't really show that it will. So that is just a nuance to take into account when constructing some of these arguments. Naomi, that kind of brings us to the end of the slides that we wanted to share at this stage. Again, just to kind of repeat all of our thanks to so many of the think tanks and researchers and academics and campaign groups who are out there producing good stuff. We hope that we've added a little bit to the work that you're doing with some of the data that we've produced today and some of the insights that we've had to offer.
Thank you both, Liam and Bobby. Do keep the questions coming in using the Q&A function below. Bobby, we've had a question in about methodology, and as a former Ipsos guru, I'm going to put that one to you. That's from Stephen, asking about how the panel of the reform sample is pulled together. Of that 4,000 reform sample, do they self-identify? Have we managed somehow to get hold of Reform's membership list? No, we haven't. Could you answer that one for us, please?
Yep. No, it's a good question, worth clarifying. So it was done on the standard 10-point scale. Would you consider voting for a range of parties? It wasn't just Reform. We did it across all the different parties, and people scoring 6+ on a 10-point scale were counted to the considerer sample, obviously netting out those who already said they were going to vote for reform. So that's the additional element of it. Self-identified 6+ on a 10-point scale.
Thank you. And while I've got you, Bobby, Caroline Lucas is asking us if we saw any disaggregation by gender within the poll, or do men and women answer the same? I know that we've got some quite interesting gender breakdown within the segments from poll 1, but just wondering whether you saw anything differently here.
No, I saw Caroline's question. No, it's a really good question. I mean, it is all of the data is available. It has all been analysed by gender. So digging into that specifically to do more on what are the gender divisions, it didn't massively stand out as a defining factor across the reform samples in terms of differences within between genders within that group. But there are definitely nuances there in different perspectives between men and women on it. So it is worth disaggregating, Caroline, and we have all of that data if you want to follow up.
Thank you, Alex. Answering your question, slides will be available after this. We're recording. The whole webinar will be available on the Best Written website after we've finished today. I'm going to now bring in a question that I think I'm going to give to Liam to answer, please. It's if some of these groups are a little bit more economically progressive, socially liberal, maybe even pro-European, why are they voting reform at all, or telling us that they intend to? Why are they, Theo asks, not going to Green instead, now that we have a populist left leader who supports closer relations with Europe?
So I think this is a great question. So I think it's worth just reflecting on 2 or 3 things here. So there are a few things that reform voters do have in common. And when you look across those different 5 segments of reform, there are some big things that they've got in common. So one is the priority that is attached to immigration reform. Second is a sense of pessimism about the future. Third is a sense that local areas may be in decline. What distinguishes civic pragmatists, though, in particular, is that even if they feel their area is in decline, they actually have the comfort of feeling that community spirit in their area is much, much stronger. So if you look at the data on, one of the questions we asked was, do you feel there's a good sense of community spirit in your area? Amongst civic pragmatists and the melancholy middle, that those were positive scores. Amongst disgusted disruptors and left behind collectivists, they were very negative scores. But there is definitely something to do with area that is going on. But I suppose the final message is that amongst civic pragmatists, there is a chunk who are considering Green. There is a chunk that are considering Labour. There is a chunk that is considering Lib Dem. There is no overwhelming alternative political party that civic pragmatists favour, but 41% of that group is merely considering reform rather than intending to vote for reform. So it is definitely the softest of all of the segments. Melancholy middle is not very far behind. But there is an openness to a range of different parties. We had a long debate, as you always do, about how to christen these segments. And civic pragmatists really, they are, as the name suggests, they're very pragmatic. They are civically minded. They are really hacked off with the state of the country. There is, a preference amongst that group for the proverbial strong leader. So there are definite similarities with other segments of reform, but there is an openness to, look, we just got to do what works.
Thank you. Bobby, we've had a couple of questions that are on the theme of the Tory party. Is there a segment in there that they ought to be trying to target? What kinds of messages would resonate well with them? Or is this really just surrendering the traditional Tory vote over to the Reform Party now?
Yeah, good questions. And can I just finish on that point Liam was making as well on what unites those groups that stand, what attracts them to reform from those 2 groups that are further down that side. I mean, I do think that strong leader bit, immigration attitudes, concern about cultural change, all of that is definitely a core element of it. But that strong leader one is quite telling, and it does reflect something I think Deborah Mattson said about her work looking across Europe was that sense of almost you just need someone to come in to shake it up. The phrase that she used from German experience was that the traditional parties felt like a cup of stale coffee where they were looking for an energy drink. And that was across the political spectrum. And I think there is an element of actually that may help explain why groups that you think that have attitudes that don't fit very well at all with this are not much to lose. Why not shake it up in some ways? And that the shake up option is coming from that side. So that would be one. On the conservative one, the traditional conservative group is named like that because it does come from that type of that is their voting history. So in terms of what's attracting them, immigration again is very, very strong among that group, that sense of immigration and that incredible sense of decline. I mean, I think they are the ones that are really, really focused on things have gone wrong and no sense of optimism for the future. It is an older segment who are not just thinking about themselves, but actually thinking about their families and what comes next, and have really lost the sense that things can get better. And so again, it points to that radical shake-up that isn't really coming from the Conservative Party, and they're not convinced by that.
Thank you, Bobby. Along the lines of the question we had about whether there's gender difference, Duncan Hames is asking whether any of these segments are more or less present in the other nations of GB than England, like Scotland and Wales.
That is a good question. I'm not sure that we've got all of that data. Again, it's one of those ones where, as Liam said at the beginning, great to pump this data out into wider community for people to look at, because it is all disaggregated. But I guess our focus was much more on the overall picture. There definitely will be differences, and from going through the tables, you can see differences. But that would be very worthwhile following up if people were picking up.
Especially with next year's elections ahead of us. Thank you very much, Duncan, for that question. Liam, Kenny is asking, I think, a question that is about style over substance. He says, these voters are fed up with greed and fed up with politics, but not fed up with the greediest politician of all, Farage. This is about performance over policy, isn't it?
I mean, this, I think, really comes back to something that Bobby Duffy just said about the importance that people attach to the role of the strong leader. Kelly Beaver, who's the chief executive of Bobby's old shop, Ipsos Mori, gave me a useful phrase at the beginning of the year on one of our seminars at St. Anthony's, which is that voters were just prepared to roll the dice. But by and large, they were rolling the dice with known quantities. So if you look at the populist leaders that have success, I mean, apart from perhaps Romania, Le Pen in France, or Farage, or Trump, or Maloney. I mean, these are figures who have actually been around quite a long time, who feel quite familiar to voters, and therefore perhaps feel like they're perhaps a tiny bit less of a risk. But frankly, people are so hacked off with what they see as broken politics, they are prepared to roll the dice, but with what feels like a known quantity. And I think you can't disconnect this from the sense of pessimism that people feel. So one of the real characteristics of these voters is a sense that things are going to get worse in the future, and that crucially, their kids' generation is going to get much worse. So for families who have experienced multi-generational decline, who see that decline continuing, there is just a real sense that you've got to just try and blow it all up, push the plunger, take the risk, roll the dice. And I think that is where Mr. Farage's appeal is coming from.
Thank you. David is asking, and I'm going to put this to Bobby, about those who don't normally vote. Obviously, we saw in the referendum in 2016 a huge number of people turn out to vote who haven't previously. Are we likely to see something like this happen again at the next general election? What do we know from the data about those who normally don't vote but are now maybe curious to go towards reform?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And it was a key factor in the design of this, was to make sure that when we were doing the considering bit, that it included those groups who don't normally vote, because I think that is the potential here. So they are a key constituency within this grouping, absolutely, and you can see that clearly in the data. And that is one of the key, obviously, the key questions is, does this mobilize in a different way, not unlike the EU referendum, people who wouldn't normally engage? And I guess that that capability of particular types of political appeal to actually get those people to come out and vote in these ones, I think is one of the key dynamics. And you would say, I suppose one thing that maybe we haven't said quite as strongly as that comes through in the report is the disgust and anger is incredibly strong. And it was interesting, the emotional questions got the biggest differentiation from the public as a whole. So using words like disgust and anger were the bits that really made reform voter and considerers stand out. And when you've got that really high emotional response and feelings about these types of things, they are more likely to lead to action. So, I mean, it's a long way out. Well, we've obviously got elections next year, but from a general election, it's a long way out to see how that develops. But you would say that the conditions are there for that emotion to carry people who would not normally engage into engaging in voting and in a general election. So I would say that is a very high possibility that we will see different people who wouldn't normally turn out driven by that really strong sense of emotion.
Thank you. Sergey is asking if we asked anything about whether Reform, who are obviously positioning themselves very much as the champions of patriotism, are being funded by foreign money. He's referring to it as foreign crooks, and whether that might have an impact on whether people are likely to stick or turn away from reform. Did we test whether or not foreign influence in a political party is likely to be a good message to turn them off that party?
So we didn't test that message, but there is a strand of our work which is the follow the money piece of the work. And we have presented some of the highlights of this work to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, which has a piece of work underway as part of its work on defending democracy. What we did is we looked at, in the YouGov data, we looked at media consumption patterns. And this independent ethnographic study has got some very useful work on media patterns too. Just like a couple of headlines that emerged from this. In quite a short period of time, so about 4 years after 2020 through to very early 2025, we were able to map about £158 million of money flowing into what is now emerged as the populist media political system. Overwhelmingly, that money is going into a well-known TV station, but a lot of chunks of that money is then falling from that well-known TV station into the bank accounts of reform politicians. So you've now got this really close organic relationship between the media and political system. That's also true of social media. So if you look at the way that some politicians are now monetizing ad revenue, which is obviously algorithmically promoted according to particular kinds of messages, that is now generating quite significant amounts of cash flow too. Now, the transparency requirements around investments in media systems are obviously very different to the transparency requirements around investments in politics. So there are some big questions that we've got to answer in the elections bill when it comes before the House next year. The second thing, though, Naomi, that I wanted to flag is that when we did the network analysis on the kinds of accounts that people were following, what emerged is that it's basically GB News and others have basically built the foundations for what is an echo chamber for US populism. And if you follow one or two of these accounts, in particular on Instagram, you are then sucked in to a pretty sealed world that will just feed you outrage. And a huge amount of that is generated by American populists, not UK populists. So there are some really quite profound media and financial dynamics at work, and it requires people to think quite differently around what is political funding in the future, because I don't think you can separate political funding and media funding in the way that we used to anymore. I think we're in a very different world now. And that's because we get onto cryptocurrency.
We've had a question about perception versus reality, economic precarity being the point. How much of it is real rather than perceived? Are 50-something homeowners as economically precarious as the 20-something renters in the gig economy? Bobby, I think maybe you could take that one in terms of the relative economic wealth we found within the different 5 segments.
Yeah, no, there are significant differences across the segments as we outlined, and some are more financially secure than others, particularly that traditional conservative group, and the melancholy middle is kind of actually fairly secure. I mean, I do think it's a good question about perceptions versus reality. We're seeing a lot of that right now with lots of fake claims in all sorts of different environments, and a sense of decline that doesn't meet the reality of things. So, lots of discussion lately about people's perceptions of that things are getting much worse on crime or in London or wherever, based on reports, individual reports and anecdotes rather than the real data. So we do this is a general problem of declinism, sense of declinism, based on an information environment that it amplifies those examples of things that have gone wrong, that people are generalizing from incorrectly. So I think that this is a much broader issue of us losing a sense of connection to a reality-based view of what's actually happening, that is being increasingly played on in an information environment that is set up to focus on those scarier stories. So it definitely plays out within reform voters overall, and then it plays out more within individual segments within reform. But that sense of decline and lack of better future can be felt from any kind of economic position for people, because it is that sense that, are things going to get better or worse? Even if I'm relatively secure compared to others, what does that mean for my children and grandchildren? And what does their future look like, is just as important in people's motivations. So this is one of the conundrums of our time, is the reality is better than lots of people think, but in many ways, but that sense of fear for the future is also real. It is not made up from people, and just trying to convince them otherwise is going to be really tough without actually showing how that's going to be better for them. So yeah, it is the contrast between perceptions and reality on these things is a key dynamic, but no easy straightforward answers that messaging will help with. It has to be something that people feel.
Thank you.
Naomi, can I just add? I mean, I think this is such an important point, because we can't just look at what people's actual balance sheet looks like. We've got to look at their perception of how they think they've done compared to their hopes of the past, their peers, and their future. And so if you look again at disruptors and left behind collectivists, half say that they're worse off than they hoped they would be at this stage of life. That's double the national average. 1 in 4 say that they've fallen behind their peers, again double the national average. And about 1/3 expect their wealth to decline over the next decade, again much higher than the national average. So it's really important to get the kind of social comparison theory in here. It's not just about the actual numbers. It is how people's perceived they're doing compared to their hopes, their peers, and their futures.
Thank you, Liam. While we've got you, a question, I guess, from somebody who's probably seen the work that the British election study did a couple of weeks ago, showing that Labour is losing most of its vote to Don't Know, Greens and Lib Dems, rather than Reform. So the question is it even worth Labour knowing all of this data and chasing Reform voters when the polling is showing that actually they're not really losing that many to them?
Yes, this is a great question. And we were very lucky actually to be able to host Jane Green in the House of Commons to brief us on some of this really important work. And the truth is, Labour is losing 2 to 3 times more voters to the Lib Dems and Greens than Labour is losing to Reform. And so the kind of political strategy that Labour needs is to focus on building a progressive coalition that helps reattract those voters that are being lost to the Lib Dems and the Greens, but couples it with those tractable groups of Reform voters like civic pragmatists and the melancholy middle. There is not going to be a successful Labour strategy that is about calibrating messages to disgusted disruptors and the more extreme of the Reform coalition. That is a dead end. And so, in a way, that is one of the messages that we want to get across. Think forensically about the different groups of Reform voters, focus on those groups who are potentially tractable, and couple that with a coalition building strategy that actually unites the progressive coalition together. Arguably, that isn't necessarily the political strategy that we have seen from the Labour Party over the last few months. But I think my personal advice would be that kind of electoral political strategy is going to be far more beneficial in the years ahead.
Thank you. We've had a lot of questions about, did we ask this, did we ask that, things like PR, nationalisation, and so forth. And also, Bobby, messengers. It's great to have the message. It really depends who's delivering it. That hasn't yet been within the scope of this work, but it is certainly something that we're going to be thinking about in the future. But I was going to ask you, Bobby, if you wanted to take a question that has come in on and maybe look, it'll be Liam as well because he's done quite a lot of work on this, but the follow the money lessons that we can take from the USA, where big business did get, well, certainly some of the tech companies got behind a greedy leader and voters fell for it, even though actually many of those companies are now worse off in terms of share price. Is there anything that we're seeing here that could be a stark warning to them in terms of their support for reform?
I think Liam is much more expert on this.
Come on then, Liam.
Well, all I would say is that there is obviously a really significant, so the absolute core of the Reform vote is profoundly skeptical about big business. And so they are much more likely to say that the market is rigged in favour of the rich and powerful. They are far more likely to say that you don't get a fair day's pay anymore for a fair day's work. They're much more likely to say that in order to get on in Britain today, you have to be born in the right family. So there is a real sense actually that hard work no longer is what it takes to get you on in life, because for many of these voters, hard work has not paid. So, at the moment that hasn't featured in a lot of the Reform policy proposals. But if we get into a situation over the next couple of years where there is a real battle with Reform, as there will be, then there is got to be a very significant risk that Reform as a party takes account of what are those core sentiments of its core voters. So I think if I was in big business, I would be incredibly wary about flirting with this kind of politics.
Okay, Bobby, I am going to give one to you now about longitudinal analysis. Somebody's sort of asking, is there a risk that these segments and polling overemphasize the differences between voter types, whereas the longitudinal studies suggest there is relatively little polarization on core values? That's from Hannah.
That's a great question, and it's a really important message to get across. I mean, we do a big series of studies on culture wars, as well as we've been doing for a number of years, and as well as running the World Values Survey in the UK, which again we're going to be repeating next year. And the message that we keep repeating from that is that we are not nearly as divided or dislike each other as we hear all the time. There's the extremes that are amplified, and there's much more connection between people than you would think from what the media, social media, political discussions. We're much more connected. I would say, just as one caveat on that, so I agree, longitudinal tracking this is changing all of these types of things, right? Not just snapshots, which are valuable in their own right, really important. What I would say is we've just done a new culture wars study updating our trends, and we're bringing that out in the next month or so with Ipsos. What I would say is things have shifted a bit in that, even from, and it hadn't shifted 2019 through to 2021 and 23. Now we're seeing slight shift. So I think things are moving in a way that we should take note of. Not, again, really clear, not as bad as it seems. More connected, but things are shifting, and we should take that seriously.
Thank you. Okay, final question I'm going to put to Liam. Lovely question to end with. This research is fascinating. How can organisations and political parties, particularly Labour, harness this data and use it ahead of a general election to prevent a reform government?
That is a great question. And so there are basically two answers to this. I think one, remember that good politics and good policy rely on good political strategy. And that means that you've got to answer the question first, who is it that we're trying to get to vote for us? And what we want to try and do here is explain that there is a very wide group of people who are currently thinking about voting reform. And there is a very large soft underbelly to that vote. There is a group of voters who can definitely be switched and coupled with a wider coalition of voters who do not want to see Mr. Farage become Prime Minister. But the second thing I'd say, Naomi, is, please get stuck into the data that we're sharing. I mean, we embarked on this project to try and help ensure that people genuinely have the data and the arguments available to them. This is like one humble effort to that wider progressive effort. But we would love you to get, your hands dirty, get stuck into the data, tell us what you see, what you think. We have got more work together planned over the weeks and months ahead. But we would just, this has got to be a collective effort, basically, to stop Mr. Farage becoming Prime Minister.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. All the details of this work is on the Best Written website. We're going to be inviting you all back for something pre-budget, plenty more data and analysis to come. As Liam says, we want to empower all of you to use it as you can within your own organisations. And if you need to get in touch with any further follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at Best Written. My big thanks to Bobby and to Liam for joining us today, and to all of you at home for tuning in. Goodbye.
Goodbye.